Well, good evening and welcome to Russia Christi Bunker. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, thanks for taking the time out of your evening. I suppose you've got no place else to go, so we welcome you to our evening this evening and the interview that we're going to be doing. For those of you who are new to Russia Christi, we are a student campus ministry that began in the United States, but we are now well established here in South Africa with 5 chapters at the University of Rhodes, Stellenbosch University, University of Pretoria, Northwest University, and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And our purpose is to train and equip Christians to better understand the Christian faith, to be able to engage others in meaningful discourse and discussions about Christianity as it pertains to every dimension of reality and life, and centrally to the gospel message of Jesus Christ, and to answer people's questions and objections. Of course, there are many in our current age, and there are too many at the universities. And so we come alongside Christians to disciple and mentor them and encourage and equip them. And this evening, we actually have our guest speaker, Dr. Simpson, who is coming to us from North Carolina in the United States. Dr. Simpson has actually worked with Russia Christi in the United States, and so is familiar with our ministry. And also, given where we are with the current crisis in the world, he's an interesting person for us to interview this evening because his background is in economics. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, as I understand, and spent much of his life working in that field. And we, here in South Africa, are the question of economics is going to be a big question. We're all going to have to address these issues at some level. And so this evening, we have a privilege. We are privileged to have somebody whose field of expertise is in this region. And so we're going to allow Dr. Simpson to speak to us about the subject of socialism and capitalism. And if you're not sure what those terms are, we'll kind of unpack that as well. And he's recently published a book on the subject called Socialism versus Capitalism. What does the Bible have to say? That book came out recently, and you can go on to the various links for that, which you can find on Amazon. I believe, Dr. Simpson, that the book is in Kindle form. Hey? Yes. Dr. Simpson also has a website, thomassimpson.com, which you can visit, as does Russia Christi South Africa, russiachristi.co.za, where you can visit our RC website. And also on that website, we'll find lots of articles on apologetics issues and discussions on various important subjects, book recommendations and things like that. So do take the time to check out Russia Christi. Our other person joining us this evening is John Williams. John Williams is coming to us from Grahamstown in South Africa. He formerly taught at Rhodes University in the Department of Accounting for 13 years. He's a chartered accountant, and he's now working for GBS Mutual in Grahamstown. And he comes in as our local South African financial. He knows a lot more than I do. So I needed to bring somebody in who understands what a balance sheet actually is. And so John is joining us as well to ask maybe the more acute questions and to help me as well and help us who don't have economics background to understand this critical subject. All right, Dr. Simpson, that's my introduction. Thank you for joining us this evening. And I believe you're going to do a lecture for us in which you'll do a PowerPoint presentation, after which we will then switch back to your video, seeing you. And then we're going to follow that up with a Q&A session between John and myself. And then we were looking forward to taking lots of questions from the audience on YouTube. Thank you. And that's the plan for the format this evening.
Very good. Well, thank you for that introduction, Simon. It's always good to see you and to be a part of an event with you. Thank you for this invitation. This particular topic, I might point out, is capitalism versus socialism has become a pretty hot issue in the United States. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on that. I got involved in this a few years ago when Corey Miller and I were traveling along with several other people from Russia Christi in Israel. and we were having a number of conversations as we were visiting different sites. And anyhow, Corey from that asked me to do a presentation to a Ratio symposium. And I did so. There was a lot of interest, and I believed that I was approaching this from a unique perspective. I had not found anyone who had kind of looked at it in the way that I have looked at it. And I thought I had some worthwhile findings. So this became not only a presentation at a symposium, but Corey and I agreed that it would be a good idea to convert this into a book. So the outcome is the book you've just mentioned. I'm the faculty advisor for Ratio Christi. My wife and I are big supporters of Ratio Christi, really believe in the need for apologetics on our campus and every campus around the globe. And so I'm really delighted to be a part of your Ratio event today. So I have prepared these PowerPoint slides, and we'll be going through them. And I'm approaching this from the perspective of the situation in the United States, kind of looking at this historically. And if we go back to our very beginnings 4 centuries ago, we were settled by people who had crossed the Atlantic to seek freedom, to seek opportunity. That American culture from the very beginning was receptive to capitalism, or a market-based economy where people were free to trade at prices that they would negotiate. Individual initiative has always been an important part of the American experience. Many of the groups, in fact, the original settlers here 400 years ago, came here primarily for religious freedom, that they wanted to be able to worship God in the way that they believed God sought to be worshiped, and free from constraints that they were facing and conflicts that they were facing in Europe. And another important factor here is the influence of Enlightenment thinking and natural law component of that. If we go back and we look at the early years of this nation, which we're talking now about the latter part of the 18th century, so we have 2 primary documents that we look upon as the basis of our nation, particularly our form of governance. One is the Declaration of Independence, which really turns to natural law and individual rights and freedom under natural law. And then we have our Constitution. So you can think of the Declaration of Independence as being the general principles, articulating the general principles of governance. And the Constitution is really the document that translates those into a legal document, a legal foundation for this nation. Socialism, in contrast to Europe and many other parts of the world, socialism, until at least recently, never really had much impact. It kind of ran against the grain of our culture. And you might find it interesting that trade unions, which in many parts of the world were very heavily involved in the socialist movement, trade unions in the United States never embraced or were interested in bringing socialism to the United States. I think they generally thought that they were going to do better for their workers apart from socialism by continuing to interact with employers in a market-based setting. Now, the Great Depression had an impact on interest in socialism because you have in Marx, particularly Das Kapital, there's the argument that in capitalist systems, things get worse and worse over time. You get greater business cycles, greater amplitudes, bigger peaks, bigger troughs. And this just seemed to coincide with the teachings of Marx in that regard. And so many people were attracted to Marx at that time. But then we had World War II and the onset of the Cold War. And in the Cold War, our major adversary was the Soviet Union, Moscow. And that was at that time really the center of Marxism. And so that led to a lack or a loss of interest on the part of those who might have been otherwise attracted to Marxism. So Marxism became more of our adversary at that time. And if we take a look at the socialist systems, and I'll include here the communist systems that were put in place after World War II, as time evolved, those systems did not perform very well. I think the best illustrations of this are Germany and Korea. Germany was divided until the late 1980s, was divided into East and West. East was under communist or socialist influence. The West was an open market economy, capitalist economy. Here we have culturally the same people. They're inhabiting basically the same part of the earth. And the contrast in terms of not only the standard of living, but the degree of freedom was palpable. And everything, the same thing can be said about Korea. I mean, today, for example, between North and South Korea, one is a communist system, the other is a market-based system or a capitalist system. So it has been demonstrated in many different ways that market-based systems or capitalist systems outperform socialist systems in terms of the standard of living. But it also became clear that these socialist systems were really plagued by corruption, widespread corruption. And in fact, we have the collapse of Eastern Europe, and then a couple of years later, the Soviet Union. And I would argue that it was just their flaws, the extent of corruption, just the corrosiveness of the system that led to their collapse. More recently, we have the example of Venezuela, and we've been able to watch Venezuela deteriorate, really almost disintegrate before our very eyes. And it's a socialist system that is just heavily influenced by corruption. It's a very, very sad situation there. And I might also point out that in terms of the post-war period, particularly over recent decades, really under the U.S. influence, primarily U.S. influence, market-based systems or capitalist systems were viewed to be best practices. I mean, I did quite a bit of work during my professional career with the International Monetary Fund, to a lesser extent the World Bank, and many of the programs that were being promoted by both of those organizations were really aimed at getting the best out of a market-based system, getting the right infrastructure in place in order to enable a market-based system to really kind of unleash the energy and creativity of economies. But one of the things that has been particularly, I think, surprising in light of this experience is in the United States, and I don't know to what extent in your part of the world, but in the United States, there's been a fascination, an infatuation with socialism. We saw it 4 years ago with Bernie Sanders, and as he ran for president, and the widespread interest, particularly among younger people, that was very evident during that period. And I might say that Cory Miller, president of Ratio Christi, was the one who really convinced me that this was more than a flash in the pan. This was something that was going to be persisting for some time. More recently, we've had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a representative from New York in our Congress, who has been the younger version of the socialist movement and image of the socialist movement. As I mentioned, it's mainly younger people who have been attracted to socialism. If you look at surveys and why it is that they're embracing socialism, they seem to think that it's a more fair system. It's one that promotes more equality. There's less competition among people, that you don't have to compete in cutthroat competition. You don't have to worry about your livelihood. That for some reason they see this system as being plagued by greed. And for many, they think that there are certain things that tend to be costly that can be provided for free in the socialist system. And I might just point out, just like the Great Depression of the 1930s had an impact in terms of interest in socialism and Marxism, the Great Recession of a little over a decade ago has had an important impact in terms of people's thinking, particularly this notion that it was greed, particularly greed on Wall Street and the financial system, that brought on that very unfortunate series of events. And today, too, we're finding people in the church who are coming to the view that Christian teaching is consistent with socialism, that the socialist system would be more in line with the teachings of Jesus Christ and what we learn from the Bible. And, part of this is the Bible's just continuous thread in terms of concern for those who are struggling, those who are not, who are facing very desperate situations, and our responsibility to respond to them, to respond to the poor, the widow, the sojourner. There also the account of the early Christian community in Jerusalem that's described in Acts 2 and 4, where we're told that their numbers were growing day by day, that they had basically a commune in which people were selling their possessions and turning over the proceeds to a common fund. And the common fund was being used for just taking care of people's needs. And so that many look upon that as a biblical prescription for what we should be seeking. And I personally think that from my studies of Karl Marx, his life and his writings, that I think that episode had an influence on him and his thinking. In fact, there's a lot of commonality between some of the terms that are used in those accounts in Acts, as well as what you find in some of Marx's writings. And another illustration that is used is Jesus' encounter with the rich young ruler, where the young ruler asked him what he needed to do in order to have eternal life. And it's very interesting in terms of this account. Jesus goes through the commandments, basically the 5th through the 10th commandments, and asks the young man about those. And the young man says, I've been obedient, I've obeyed them. And then Jesus turns around and he says, sell all your possessions and give the proceeds to the poor. And I think many have taken that to suggest, well, really what Jesus is saying is you should basically have an economic system that's based on everybody selling their possessions and pooling the funds and people drawing as they had need. So I would like to go through biblical teaching in the context of what I'll call the pillars of an economic system. For those who have studied economics, you generally find that in an introductory course in economics, one of the first things they want to do is give you a definition of what economics is, and that definition always involves scarce resources, producing and distributing goods and services that are the result of these scarce resources. And some textbooks, particularly the textbook that I studied when I was a college student, it was written by a Nobel laureate, Paul Samuelson. He posed the discussion of economic systems in light of three questions: what, how, and for whom. So what I've done in terms of this little table is across the top, I put what the second item: what is produced, how is it produced, and how is it distributed. That's the what, how, and for whom questions. I've also added the question of who owns property, because when we're talking about capitalism versus socialism, very different notion of who owns property. In a capitalist system or a market-based system, property is privately owned. In a socialist system, it's collectively owned. So if we take a look at the first row in that table has socialism and communism. In each case, for each issue, it's the state that owns the property. The state has, through some central planning authority, determines what's produced, determines how it's going to be produced, and it's the state that is responsible for the distribution of that product. We would now call it income distribution. And in a fascist system, which oftentimes when people are talking about fascism, they're looking at it as the opposite of the socialist system. But interestingly, the leaders in the fascist movement in the 19th century were socialists. They just developed their own variant of socialism, but in their variant of socialism, property was privately owned, but it was the state that determined what got produced. How it got produced, in some cases the state got involved in that, but it was largely a private decision. And then the distribution of what got produced was both state and private. Now, in the case of a market system is based on private ownership of property. Individuals and businesses determine not just what is produced, but how it gets produced. The second and third columns there. And then the market determines how this gets distributed. And one of the concerns, and I think an important factor too behind this interest in socialism, is the evidence that income has not become more equally distributed, particularly in the United States, but if anything has become less equally distributed. And so that's been a matter of concern. It may be a reason why we're experiencing riots in the United States. It seemed like each and every day for the last week and a half too. So I wanted to then look at what the Bible tells us about those four pillars. And when it comes to the ownership of property, I think it's fairly clear that the Bible condones private ownership of property. I think we look at the 10 Commandments, we look at the 8th commandment. The 8th commandment says we are not to steal. In other words, we are not to take something that belongs to someone else. In other words, that is somebody else's private property. They own that property. They are entitled to that property, and we are not to take it without their permission. And then you get to the 10th commandment, which deals with coveting. I mean, we're not even to covet other people's property. We're to accept what we have and not wish that we had or try to connive to get what others have. Then when it comes to whether it's collective decision making or individual decision making, I think the Bible is fairly clear that individuals are capable of making their own decisions. The decision that's the most important, that we as Christians believe is the most important decision one can make, is whether to accept the gift of salvation through Jesus Christ. And it is only us. No one else can make that decision for us. That's the most important decision in our lives. So if God gives us responsibility for that decision, I think God must believe that we're capable of making well-informed decisions in the marketplace as well. The Bible, though, is very specific about our responsibility for caring for the less fortunate. But in that context, it's not clear. The Bible really doesn't have a prescription in terms of that this should be coercive through the state. The teachings regarding assisting the poor are really to be an individual responsibility. They're a corporate responsibility, but in each case, it's to be it's a voluntary action. So we are called upon to respond to need. And I personally think that when we do it the biblical way, that there are relationships that develop here that are lost when we do it corporately. And you're going to see that I'm not advocating that we scrap the welfare system that we have and get the state out of it. I'm not necessarily arguing for that, but I really would like people to think more about this particular issue in terms of how we are supposed to respond to need. What is the Bible telling us? And what about wealth? Is wealth considered to be something that is wrong for people to have wealth? Does the Bible condemn wealth? I would argue the answer is no. I think the Bible is very specific in many cases that God blessed certain, particularly patriarchs in the Bible, by bestowing on them wealth. But in each case, they had their priorities straight. And I think if we go back to the rich young ruler, it's interesting that Jesus didn't ask him about the first 4 commandments, which deal with our relationship with God. But what Jesus told him was, sell your possessions and give the proceeds to the poor. I think what was going on in that particular encounter is that Jesus looked into the heart of this man and he saw that his wealth was standing between him and God. And whatever it is that's standing between us and God, we're instructed to get rid of it. God is to be number one. And if that's the case, then I think God is quite okay in terms of possessions. But I think the Bible is also very clear that people who have lots of possessions, who are wealthy, are going to have struggles that others aren't, that are going to be drawing them away from placing God first. They're going to come to love their possessions more than they love God. It's going to be very tempting. So there are challenges that wealthy people face that others don't face to the same degree. But it's not just wealth, it's power, sex, all kinds of things that have stood between individuals and God, and any of those are to be removed, and God is to be number one. I think that's clear from biblical teaching. Now, other things in terms of what the Bible teaches us, work is expected. Paul is very clear in Thessalonians, saying that if you're not willing to work, you're not entitled to get food from other people. You're expected to work. And not only is there this expectation, but you find throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament, the notion that work is actually good for a person. It's fulfilling for a person to work. And I think we oftentimes overlook this the need for somebody to be able to do constructive things and to contribute something, and how that really satisfies an inner need in an individual. And I think the Bible has been telling us that all along. I think that the Bible also says that employers have discretion when it comes to compensating their employees. We have the parable of the owner of the vineyard who was hiring day laborers, and he paid them all the going wage, regardless of whether they started work early in the morning and worked throughout the day, or whether they came at the end of the workday. The message was that he had that right to compensate them as he saw fit. Now, of course, the parable is telling us about those who come to accept the gift of grace from God, whether it's as a child or whether it's on their deathbed, that God is sovereign and has the right to provide them eternal life. And I think we find other examples in the Bible that suggest that the market prices that prevail in a marketplace are to be accepted, that they're not to be challenged or somehow think that they're immoral or there's something wrong with those outcomes. Now, when we look at a capitalist system, its capitalist system is based on self-interest, and people are pursuing their self-interest. And I would distinguish between self-interest and greed. Greed is excess. We can talk about satisfying a hunger need versus gluttony. The difference of degree, and we can see it in other areas as well. I would argue that God created us with a certain self-interest, and this is a part of our survival. And a market-based system or a capitalist system relies on the role of prices. I've talked about prices in terms of what the Bible has to say about them, but prices play an amazing role. And Simon was talking about economic theory, and maybe get into some economic theory, or he would like that. We don't have enough time to develop all of the theory that lies behind this, but let me just say that the price mechanism works in an amazing way when prices are free to move, when people are free to enter or leave the marketplace. There's an underlying order that is just truly amazing. Now, Adam Smith, who we oftentimes label as the father of economics, back in 1776, which was the year of our independence, published the book, The Wealth of Nations, or that's the shorthand version. Adam Smith was not an economist, or at least he didn't regard himself as an economist. Adam Smith regarded himself as a moral philosopher. Adam Smith, as best I can determine and other writers can determine, was a committed follower of Christ. And he was a student of the Bible. He saw God in creation. He saw so much of what surrounded us as an order that was divine in its underlying nature. And I think he thought that that applied to the economic sphere, and that he had this very famous phrase in The Wealth of Nations. It's not out of the benevolence of let's see if I can get these in the proper order, the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we get our dinner in the evening, but it's out of their self-interest. And another thing, one of the things that I can say as an economist who's been practicing economics for quite some time is that what we have learned since the publication of The Wealth of Nations is really based on that fundamental understanding. We just see more and more ways in which the invisible hand is at work. And we can see how it draws in the self-interest on the part of the participants, draws in the information that's available at any time regarding the resources available, regarding the production techniques available. And the self-interest encourages innovation. We in the United States have been through a period, and other parts of the world have experienced this as well, but just phenomenal innovation, particularly in the information technology area. And it's been entrepreneurs who have been pursuing their self-interest that have been behind this. Is the capitalist system perfect? No, it has flaws. Will any economic system this side of the second coming of Christ be perfect? The answer is no. Jesus even told us. Jesus told us the poor will always be with us. So that problem of solving income distribution is going to remain with us until he comes again. So, we can point out there are market economies have had problems with monopolies, what I refer to here as externalities. This would be things like pollution, for example, of the air and the water, where the producers don't take into consideration what they're doing to the environment. They're motivated more by their private bottom line. What we call public goods, things that are important for particularly like national defense, and when it comes to just public safety, when it comes to things like pandemics, for example, without the role of government, the outcomes are not going to be the most favorable. There are going to be some problems, and the issue of inequality. Market economies result in inequality. What I try to point out in the book is you've got to be careful in terms of looking at inequality. There are lots of reasons why there is inequality, and it measured as a snapshot at any particular point in time. And I don't want to get into all the reasons now, but perhaps if this is of interest, we can come back to it later in the Q&A session. Now, oftentimes people look at capitalist systems as being basically devoid of government, that there really isn't any particular role for government. And I would argue that that's not the case, that government has a very important role in a capitalist system, and particularly one that's based on Christian principles. First of all, there's the issue of justice. And we are seeing our cities in flame now because of concerns about justice, but we turn to government to address the issues of justice. And the Bible is very clear that that is a major responsibility of government. Government has a role for protecting its citizens, for its people, from external threats as well as from internal disorder. I think that's clear from biblical teaching, and that I think just about every economist would say, yes, that's a primary responsibility of government. And government has a responsibility for establishing the framework, the legal framework within which people are able, free to contract with each other, to decide whether they're going to work for this person or not, whether they're going to buy this thing or not. So there is a very important role for government in any economic system, including a capitalist system. And when it's done right and when it's based on biblical principles, and basically the biblical law, you find that those systems perform the best. Those are the best of the capitalist system. So there's a connection between our Judeo-Christian beliefs and what we're taught and economic performance here. So moving into a socialist system, as I pointed out before, with the socialist system, their decisions are made through a collective. There's a central planning agency. It's basically government that's going to be making the decisions. Property is collectively owned. It's not privately owned. And as we look through a socialist system, first of all, there is no clear blueprint that has been established for a socialist system. Socialism, the notion of socialism is kind of in the mind of the beholder, because some people have one notion and other people have another notion of really what the system is in practice. But there's no general blueprint for how you design a socialist system that's universally accepted. That's not true for a market system, particularly in the economics profession. We know pretty well how you go about designing a market system, and one that corrects for using government to correct for some of the flaws that I mentioned. But there's no such counterpart in the area of socialism. The socialist system short circuits the invisible hand, that is, that coordinating role of prices, that utilization of information that comes about as people are pursuing self-interest. That doesn't work very well in a socialist system. There are very few incentives for innovation. So you compare North and South Korea, go back a couple of decades, and compare East and West Germany. In the case of South Korea and Western Germany, innovation was just an ongoing part of life. Things were very stagnant in Eastern Germany, and they remain very stagnant in Northern Korea. The other thing that I would mention that is inescapable in my mind, and that is the scope for corruption. Because when you have government making decisions, all kinds of decisions on behalf of the population, that just invites corruption, because people are going to want something different than what they're handed by government or what they might be handed, and they're going to look for ways of trying to get it. And when it comes to those instruments of government, those individuals who are administering the government's plan and the distribution and all of that, they're the ones who make the decisions, and people are going to want them to favor them, that is, the individuals, rather than somebody else. And so it invariably, I mean, the temptation for corruption is just pervasive and ongoing. And you may enter a system with the kind of culture that resists that, but at the end of the day, the result is there's going to be corruption. And we've seen this throughout all the experiences with socialism. And as I've mentioned, poor economic performance, that's just a staple in terms of the socialist systems that we've experienced, particularly in the post-war period. If we go into communism and fascism, as I mentioned, I mean, both of them really have their origins in socialism. Communism is an ideology that was developed on the part primarily of Marx and Engels. It's a very well-developed ideology. It's a notion that there are stages of history, but they lead to one end. And the next to last system is the capitalist system. And the capitalist system has inherent contradictions in those, and there's basically class warfare that's ongoing in the capitalist system, and ultimately these clashes result in the ushering in of the socialist system, the ideal socialist system, which is the communist system. And this ultimately becomes utopia. This is a utopian situation, and it's universal. So this happens throughout the world, and it's there are laws of history, and these are the laws of history tell us that this is the final form of economic system, is this utopian socialist system, which they label communism. Fascism, on the other hand, is highly nationalistic. And the notion of, particularly in Germany, we saw the notion of racial superiority, ethnic superiority. And so it's very inwardly focused. But in both cases, the individual is subordinate to the collective. Both, like the more generic socialist system, short circuit the invisible hand. And they conflict with biblical teaching. I mean, in the book, I've got some quotations particularly from Engels, indicating that is Marx's collaborator, indicating that the teachings of Christianity are not at all compatible with Marxism. And Marx himself referred to Christianity as the opium of the masses, that it was the capitalists who were exploiting the workers and putting the workers in pain, who were trying to foist on them Christianity with the notion of an eternal paradise. And Marx's view, or later in his life, his view was that this was just the opium that the capitalists were passing on to the masses to let them get by and to keep them at bay in terms of overthrowing the system. And if you read Hitler's Mein Kampf, you see that there's the notion that there's some kind of utopia is going to be achieved by the Teutonic peoples under his leadership. And if we go back and we take a look at the historical record of communism and fascism, I think the thing that stands out most clearly is that it's a legacy of death. Roughly 100 million people have died at the hands of communism. And when you take a look at the fascist systems, 6 million Jews murdered, who knows how many others who were killed by the Nazis, and more killed by the Italian and Spanish fascists. So this is not what the Bible teaches. This is not the outcome that God is seeking. So I wanted to just say a few words here, kind of in closing, about where we are today. In practice, we don't have many socialist systems still extant, and we don't have any what might be called pure capitalist systems. We're really today talking about welfare states, which are basically market-based, but government is heavily involved. And there are basically two objectives that are goals of the modern welfare state. One is socializing risk. And what I mean is that in situations where people are faced with adversity and where there's huge losses, that there's the notion that government needs to step in and address this situation collectively. So, for example, as Simon knows from his days in the United States, we in North Carolina live in an area that it's hit with some frequency with tropical storms and hurricanes. And 2 years ago, we had a devastating hurricane here. And government stepped in. The notion was that people were experiencing huge losses. They did not have the means to be able to address their plight at that time. And so government stepped in. And this government has taken on a growing role in terms of natural disasters. But it's also taken on a growing role in the United States regarding catastrophic health care. We have various programs that attempt to address that, not just the healthcare itself, but the losses that are incurred or would be incurred if there wasn't government stepping in. We have, and it's in full play in the United States today, we have unemployment insurance. So when people lose their jobs, there's a safety net that's providing for them. And so that's the nature of socializing risk, and also redistribution. Basically using the tax system primarily to take a disproportionate amount from the wealthy or the high income people and transferring that to lower income people. Today in the United States, the frontiers in terms of extending the modern welfare state or the safety net is healthcare. And we're in a presidential election year, and this is going to be likely to be front and center in terms of a policy difference between the Republican and the Democratic candidate. There's also, and in fact, there's been an effort to, in the context of responding to this COVID-19 crisis, an effort to develop and implant universal basic income so that everybody would be getting a certain amount from the government. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over the next several months as we approach Election Day in November. But one of the things we need to keep in mind as we're looking at this, and particularly the impact on behavior, is that the welfare state involves high tax rates. You have to pay for these programs. And the various programs that have been implemented, for the most part, they discourage work effort. And we know from Paul that, and from other writers in the Bible, that work is good. And so as we're extending the welfare state, we are also discouraging initiative and work effort on the part of individuals, and the satisfaction. We're basically kind of enticing them away from the satisfaction that comes about from a good day's work. Also, I would point out that it depersonalizes charity, something I mentioned before, and gives rise to entitlement attitudes. And we have generation upon generation in the United States who have been receiving government assistance and have chosen to continue to live in that lifestyle. And I think that it really, we have seduced them into a lifestyle that does not allow them to enjoy the fruits of labor. We also have lots of impediments. We have a public education system that is not providing the kinds of skills and knowledge that people need to be competitive and to be productive in the workplace today. So public policy has really failed in that area. But also, we have generation of dependency, and I think the depersonalization of charities, that when you have taxpayers who are are making the payment to the government. The government, in turn, establishes a bureaucracy to distribute it. There's a huge gap between those who are providing the wherewithal and those who receive it. And I think in the case of private charity, there's more of a personal contact, which I think is beneficial to both parties. So anyhow, I have ended here. I hope that John has some good comments. I'm sure he has some good comments and perhaps some questions. So I'll turn it over to you folks.
Thanks, Dr. Simpson. I think that was a really interesting talk that you gave us, so thank you for that. I particularly enjoyed the way in which you took those pillars of the economic systems and then looked at it from a biblical perspective. And I do think that that's certainly something very unique and not something that I've come across before in my reading. So just on a personal note, thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. And obviously, in a presentation like this, there's a limited amount of time that one has to be able to go into the full details. So I would really encourage people to get a copy of your book and to spend some time reading through that. It is really a very good read. Now, I think you made a number of really interesting comments in your talk, and I see we're getting some good questions coming through from our listeners and that. So thank you to the listeners for that. At one stage, you distinguished between self-interest and greed, and I think that's a very important distinction. And often when people are arguing the capitalism versus socialism, well, there's that debate, people don't make that differentiation. So once again, I think that was a very important point. And I suppose, my question is, in a fallen world, can we ever have safety nets in place to prevent self-interest from turning into greed?
I would argue that in a fallen world, no. I think that people are going to have temptations, and some are going to succumb to those temptations more than others. I think those who put their trust in God are going to have more protection from being seduced into those temptations. I would just point out one other thing in this context. I referred to Adam Smith and the invisible hand, and when it came to the issue of self-interest, Adam Smith looked at a statement by Jesus in a different way than most people look at it. When Jesus told us that we were to love our neighbor as ourself, Adam Smith looked upon that as Jesus saying that it's okay to love ourselves just as we are to love our neighbors. And so I think he viewed that as being Jesus telling us it's okay to pursue our self-interest. But I think in any time, and whether it's in the context of alcohol, whether you have just a drink and drink in moderation or you drink in excess, there again, in one case we know, and certainly Jesus drank wine. That seemed to be perfectly acceptable then. Presumably it is today. But there's no account whatsoever of Jesus overindulging in alcohol. So we have many temptations. We can talk about sex, and we can talk about so many other areas. And I think in each of those areas, as I pointed out before, I think that if we trust in God, then we will be constrained from overindulging. But those who don't put their trust in God, I think they're going to be many times overindulging, whether it's greed or gluttony or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Sorry, Dr. Simpson, can we perhaps ask you to stop sharing your screen, and then our listeners will be able to at least see you in person?
Okay. Oh, okay. All right.
There you go. Yeah, lovely.
Okay.
Thank you very much. You also, when you were talking about the free market economies, you mentioned the issue around externalities.
Mm-hmm.
And just sort of a comment from my side, it's amazing to see how, in a way, there's self-regulation coming in there as well, because you refer to the example of pollution, but once again, it's becoming big businesses' self-interest to look after the environment. A, because their customers are demanding that, but B, they also know for them to be around in the future, they need to make, they need to have sustainable business practices. So, once again, I just found it interesting to see how that self-interest does come back into a self-regulation kind of role in that as well. I guess it would be amiss of us not to bring up COVID-19. You did mention a little bit about it in your talk and referred to it, and I know a number of the questions we're receiving from our listeners are dealing with issues around COVID-19. I think one for me that's kind of pricked my curiosity, and I spent quite a bit of time thinking about it, and it's just around the question of scarce goods. So take, for example, face masks and ventilators and that. Now, we know there's a worldwide shortage of these. So, how does one go about dealing with this issue? Does one say, okay, well, the country who's producing them should have the first right to them, versus is the country with the greatest need, should they be getting them? Or should it be, should they just be sold to where they can make the greatest profit? And that's quite a conundrum, isn't it? And I'd just be interested in your kind of views on that.
Well, and I fully agree. There is no satisfactory solution here. I mean, one would ordinarily argue that a market system would result in an increase in price, in this case, a huge increase in price. And that would motivate potential producers everywhere to respond to that and to ramp up production and to meet this much greater demand. But then you get nations involved, and I mean, clearly we've been in conflict with China on various health products that get produced in China and some produced in the United States. And so you get nation states intervening. I mean, to a degree, what has happened in the U.S. is really through kind of public initiatives. There has been, in fact, there have been resources, public resources, lots of public resources devoted to developing healthcare products to deal with this particular situation, and then any recurrence of this or something comparable down the road. And in that way, it's kind of replicating the way a market would respond. I mean, you want more production. That's the main thing. And how do you get it? Do you just let the price mechanism do it, and then the charges of price gouging and all of that? Or do you devote more to collective action, more resources? And so we've kind of gone both routes, really.
Yes.
In this regard. I mean, one of the things that has been somewhat problematic in the United States. Now, much of the problem now is behind us, particularly when it comes to things like ventilators. I mean, we're just incident. We've got enough in the way of new equipment, and the caseload has diminished substantially, so it's no longer a serious problem. But for a while, we had the individual states, or 50 states, acting on their own, really with the blessings of the federal government, saying you negotiate this, without the federal government basically kind of coordinating all of this action. So there were times when they were really competing with each other to get PPE, and that might have been more effective for government to take a role. But here's a situation you referred to, externalities, and here's a situation where we're talking about externalities. I mean, this is something where what I do has an impact on you if I come in contact with you, and I think most, and I think even the founding fathers of this nation would argue in these circumstances there is a role for government. And one of the things that has been a major issue in the United States is that, as I mentioned, it's really been up to the individual states to determine policies and to basically handle procurement and so forth for their states. And but also the individual states have been the ones that have been issuing the orders for closures and things like that. The interaction. So the lockdown is really a state initiative. Some of it's balanced against local governments as well. But this has really, gotten into the issue of civil liberties and First Amendment rights in the United States, including the right to practice your religion. And so it's been a very interesting situation trying to balance the kind of the collective interest with what we regard as, kind of our natural law right.
Okay. I'd like to go to a question from one of our listeners, and it's from Khotso. And his question is, with healthcare being at the forefront today, owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, will capitalism still provide the solution in providing accessible healthcare for all people when the next pandemic comes?
I think that the experience that we've had, both the actions of the private sector and the actions of the government sector, I think has been a very important learning experience. So I think if the next pandemic, when the next pandemic comes, hopefully it's much later, sooner, I think that both are going to be much better prepared. I think from the standpoint of medications, I don't think that you're going to find that we're going to be as dependent on one country as we've been in the past. And I think it's going to be in the interest of the pharmaceutical companies to diversify their sources and perhaps move more of the production into the United States. So the private sector will have incentives, self-interest incentives to do that. But also, I think government has learned an important lesson in all of this in terms of what the role of government is, how to respond to a situation like this, how to stockpile at the various governmental levels, and each governmental level has a responsibility here in terms of stockpiling certain life-saving equipment. And so, I think we've learned. So I think the next time it happens, it's going to be both the private and the government sector that will respond, and I think in a much better way than we have through all of it.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's been, for me, an encouraging thing in South Africa as well, is to see how the government and the private sector in the area of healthcare have been able to work together in that. And in the context of us wanting to bring in a national insurance health insurance. I think that's been very, very positive. Another question, it's from Doubtless Faith, is you mentioned inequality and how that was a larger discussion. Could you touch on that a little? And also, is there a section in your book on that?
Yes, there is a discussion in my book on equality. A couple of salient points here without getting too deeply into the weeds. First of all, when we measure the distribution of income or the distribution of wealth, now those are two different, as you know, as an account, balance sheet and an income statement, two different things. They're related, but they're different. So if we're talking about distribution of income, it's not the same thing as the distribution of wealth. But when we're looking, if we look at the distribution of wealth, it's more unequal than distribution of income. But if we take a look at a particular, let's say, family unit at different points in time, they are going to be in different. If we're looking at quintiles, fifths of the population, they're going to be in different quintiles over the life cycle. They're going to start out in the lower quintile, and they're going to end up in the middle or maybe in the upper portion of the income distribution. So I was teaching a course for high school students in economics, and one of my students has a father who's a medical doctor. And I said, I bet your parents, when your father was going to medical school, really were straining in order to get by. And she said, yeah, I've heard a lot about that. I wasn't around, but I heard a lot about that. And then it was pretty clear that now the family is very comfortable. So if you were to look at that family back maybe a couple of decades ago, or at least the parents, and look at them today, they're in very different components. So we need to take that into consideration. So the distribution of age is important, and it's even more important for wealth than it is for income. But then we get into the issue of what people are earning at any point in time, and it's related to their productivity in the market.
Yes.
And what determines productivity? Well, a lot of it has to do with what we call human capital, which is formal education and work experience. It's also related to health. Healthier people are going to be more productive. So a lot of the differences in income are determined by differences in productivity, which are related to human capital. And some people, I just talked about a medical doctor, have invested so many years acquiring that human capital, and then several years basically working in an intern role to acquire more hands-on experience. And so that person is much more productive, creates much more value in a given day than somebody who ever went on to the university. And are we to begrudge that? I leave it to the listener to make that judgment. What about work effort? Some people work very hard. They're very industrious, and they're going to be more productive usually and earn more. Are we to begrudge their greater income because they're working harder? Or what about risk taking? Life is uncertain, and that includes a business and coming up with products that people are going to want. And there's a great deal of risk in that area. In fact, the failure rate in startup businesses is very, very high. But yet we want those businesses there. Somebody has to take on the risk here of establishing the business and trying to have the products and the location that makes it valuable for people to take advantage of that business. So if they end up earning more because they took risks. Now, in looking at risk too, we look at the people who were successful in business. We never look at those who were unsuccessful and how they lost in terms of taking risk, and as a consequence, how their lifestyle is so much different as a result of that. We just look at one tail of the distribution, so to speak. But that's another factor. So leave it to the individual, and we go through this long list of things which can explain the bulk of the distribution of income. But we're still left with something there, and I mean, I've already alluded to it, and that is, I think our equipping of young people, not just today, but this has been the case for generations, is very deficient. It's very good in some areas. It's woefully sad in other areas, and so they're not prepared to be able to earn a decent living, or the kind of thing that we would consider to be a good living, given their human capital. We didn't give them human capital, and perhaps to some extent, what we're seeing every night out in the streets these days in the United States may be reflective. I think to some degree it's reflective.
Thank you for that answer. And I think one of the issues in South Africa is obviously inequality is a huge issue in our society. Coming from the background of apartheid, where based on race, people were denied access to education, people were denied access to ownership of property, and so on. So that just complicates the whole issue around inequality. And there's obviously been various attempts at trying to address that, but unfortunately, that has not yet been successful. If we can go on to an anonymous question, and this one is: can one potentially assume that socialism as a system isn't necessarily in and of itself negative, but rather provides too much potential to be abused by corrupted leaders for their own gain?
Well, I think that's in principle, socialism is not evil. The goals are noble goals, but when you look at translating this kind of utopian ideal into something that is going to actually be in place in reality, there's just the temptation to abuse the system. And I think leaders, just take a look at North Korea. I mean, it's a family dynasty that they've established, and it's all in the name of communism. But it's passed on from one generation to the next in the same family. And certainly when you talk about abuse of the system, you've got the leader who has his own private train and his own private resort. How many ordinary citizens have anything akin to that? It's just, and from the standpoint of taking public resources, he's devoting so much of valuable resources to his own personal objectives in terms of kind of global influence through a weapon system. And is that what the people of North Korea want? Do they want to be recognized as a global nuclear power, or would they just rather have a more nutritious diet, a little more comfortable place to live in, better education for their children?
A question from Karnu. You mentioned natural law earlier. Firstly, what role does natural law play in forming of an economic system? And then second, what type of economic system would then come about?
Okay, well, proponents of, natural law, basically, the way we look at the translation of natural law is pretty much in the stated Declaration of Independence that all people are created equal, and they use the term created, and
that's interesting.
So they mean there is a creator. We can look upon the Bible as telling us that we're all created in the image of God, and so if that's the case, then all of us have great intrinsic value, and no one more valuable than anyone else. That was an underlying principle. Now, the way they practiced it was not. They adopted that principle, but at the beginning they didn't practice that in the sense that this didn't apply to everybody. It applied to men, didn't apply to women. It applied to free people, not to slaves. So there were some flaws in terms of the implementation, and hopefully over the years we've addressed those flaws, but obviously not perfectly. But there's the notion of equality, and then they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So then Jefferson, who was the one who took the pen, so to speak, in drafting the Declaration of Independence, referred to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At one point it was life, liberty, and property, but then it was decided to change that last one. But he said among them is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So those are kind of a distillation, at least from this side of the Atlantic, of the application of natural law. And I believe that it's totally consistent with a market economy and private ownership of property, individuals making decisions. There's the notion of the consent of the governed. So in other words, government gets its legitimacy from consent of the governed itself. So there's a counterpart in terms of election, selection of where citizens select their leaders, and the leaders are accountable to citizens. That's what was established, and that's the counterpart to a market economy. And as I mentioned, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. That was the time of our revolution. He was capturing ideas that people generally believed in, and his writings had influence on the founding fathers as they were developing the Constitution. But there was that kind of commonality on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of the notion of the application of natural rights.
Yeah. Dr. Simpson, I'm aware that we've taken up quite a bit of your time already. I don't know if you've got time for another question or two, or is time up?
Would I be able to ask a question, John, to Dr. Simpson?
Yes, please do.
My question to Dr. Simpson is, when attempting to get involved in this conversation on economics and socialism versus capitalism, the critics of socialism will point to, for example, Europe as example of socialist countries, and in particular the Scandinavian countries, as with their welfare states and welfare systems, hallmarks of socialism, and so they'll point to that as an example. And then in recent years, we've seen a massive recovery and growth of the economics of both China and Russia, in terms of their economic. What what does somebody as a free market capitalist and a Christian, for that matter, say to the question of those European countries, and also to the success of these former bastions of communism, that being China and Russia?
Okay. Regarding particularly the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries, I mean, Bernie Sanders has been very quick when asked, usually when he's confronted with the example of Venezuela, he says, yeah, but that's not what I have in mind. Look at the Scandinavian countries. And the Scandinavian countries do not view themselves as socialist systems. They view themselves as welfare states. There's widespread private property. People own their homes, they own their cars, they're free to choose where they work. So they are more market systems that they use the state for redistribution and for providing this social insurance that I mentioned before. And they do it to a greater extent than we do in the United States. Now we're moving in that direction. Now I would argue too that in those countries, there's much more homogeneity in the population, that it's a much more homogeneous culture. And so there's less disagreement in terms of what government should be doing than you would find in a more diverse kind of nation like the United States. So that helps the success. But one of the interesting things, and one of the countries that's not put into this group, but in many respects is very, very similar to the Nordic countries, is Greece. Now, Greece has been a basket case for much of the last decade, but Greece has had this very extended welfare state, and they overextended the welfare state. Now, in the case of the Nordic countries, when they would extend the welfare state to the point where it was really starting to choke a little bit, where it was really impairing economic performance, there would usually be a political movement to roll it back. And so, they'd get to the precipice, and then they'd stop and they'd roll it back because they started to realize that they were killing the goose that was laying the golden egg. In Greece, they didn't do that. They went way too far, and they've been paying for it ever since. But even in Greece, property is privately owned. It's much more a market system than what you would regard as the socialist system. Now, getting to your question about China and Russia, I think China and Russia are two different situations. We both have done very, very well over the last roughly 3 decades. Actually, in the case of, we're basically 3 decades or so. In the case of China, its success has come about from market reforms. And one of the things, and this may be a bit of a sidebar to your question, Simon, but one of the things that has come along is technology. And technology has really enabled the government to compensate for the loss of control that you get when you open up to markets. You start to lose control if you're the central authority because decisions are being made in the marketplace that used to be made in government. So there's generally, historically, as you've moved in the market direction, government's influence has been diminished. But modern technology has allowed the Communist Party in China to use technology to compensate for that loss of control. I mean, they can now monitor people electronically in ways that they were never as effective in monitoring people back under the old system when they had more control. So, but nonetheless, I would argue that China is built on market reform. But China is is plagued by corruption. And I believe there's kind of an underlying unrest on the part of the Chinese public because people don't like corruption. People, and the Bible tells us that corruption is sinful. So, it's kind of a C.S. Lewis sense that there's just some underlying things we know that are wrong, and corruption is one of the things. And when it's pervasive, people resist that. And that's what happened in the Soviet Union, what happened in Russia. Russia has not, in many respects, been as successful as China because it's been more of an oligarchy, and it's been a lot of favoritism. I would argue that Russia's been more like a fascist system than a market system.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, because I've had that question put in front of me. Here in Africa, where we are confronted with having been a playground for major political ideologies, Western democratic free market ideologies, political theory and economics versus socialist, communist ideologies. I think Africa is trying to discover a political theory and ideology which can govern ourselves. And so we see a lot of people pointing to, as you said, 30 decades of this tremendous growth in China, where, the pundits say, no nation has done more to pull that many people out of abject poverty than the Communist Party of China. And yet here you are saying that only the free market capitalist system can deliver. Well, here's a counter example to your position. So I do appreciate that. I do understand that there were policies that the Communist China implemented, which aren't traditionally communistic ideas. As for example, one, as I understand, and I'm not an expert on this, I've been trying to read on it, was to do with the agrarian economy and farmers. Having taken away their land, they then starve to death, because that's what you do when you take away ownership and persons. And then once your nation is quickly starving to death, you might want to review your policies, which is what I believe happened. And so that's an important question then. I think that the problem that we have here, John, as well, you might agree that perhaps Dr. Simpson has said too much, and we're probably going to need to have him back again, because I would love,
absolutely, definitely.
I would also, for our readers out there, I'd like you to know that Dr. Simpson has worked in a number of these places, has worked in China and Russia and Hungary and Angola and Uganda, as I understand, and many other countries. And I think it would be wonderful for us to ask you about those experiences in those countries, and maybe unpack, the central tenets of these major schools of thinking in economics for us, and particularly for folks like myself who don't know much about economics, but are coming to realize I better start paying attention now. I better start informing myself as a Christian so I can participate in meaningful discourse about these things, because the Bible actually takes these things quite seriously, as you have argued.
I might just point out, Simon, that I also spent time in Lesotho. I don't know if I mentioned that.
Oh, wow.
Yes,
Well, we'd love to hear that. That would be fascinating.
It was a wonderful week and a half.
Yes. And maybe when this COVID thing passes, maybe your wife and yourself can come and visit us here in South Africa. We'd love to receive you. Russia Christi South Africa would love to receive you. You're part of our team. So we'd love to do that. So, John, maybe should we call it a wrap then?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And just thanks to Dr. Simpson and to all of our listeners on YouTube, and to John for leading the interview. In future sessions, John will probably be taking the role on this topics and that, but he's now been baptized into this this lockdown way that we do things. So thanks very much, John. Thank you, Dr. Simpson, for coming on.
Absolute pleasure.
And then just for in closing, then I just got a few things I need to say here. Do go on and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Rasha Christi, and also check out our website, rashachristi.co.za. We have a growing number of talks we've done like this. So last week we had Christian Davis on the question of archaeology and the Bible. It's a great topic, very interesting. And in the coming weeks, we have a number of other interesting lectures and discussions. Next week, we will be interviewing Dr. Joe Bergeron, who is a medical doctor who wrote the medical article on the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And so that's a very interesting subject. It has all kinds of implications in theology and other areas, but I encourage you to come and listen to that. And I've listened to him speak on the subject, and you will be profoundly moved by what actually happened at a crucifixion medically from an expert. So that's our topic for next week. And in the coming weeks, we have other speakers. We have Rogers from Uganda. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce Rogers' surname because it's so crazy. But he's going to be speaking on traditional African religions and the prosperity gospel. We also have Dr. Craig Keener and his wife, who are going to be speaking to us on the question of Black man's religion, a book that he wrote a number of years ago on, is Christianity a white man's religion? We're also hoping to have Dr. Mike Lacona, an expert on the resurrection, come to talk to us about that subject, central to the Christian faith, and hopefully many others into the foreseeable future. So do consider and recommending the channel to others as well. And then also, please do consider, we had a recent push to try and begin raising support through our website. We have a place where you can click and donate to us. We are a ministry that's dependent upon your support, both prayer, but also financial support, so that we can get out there and do great events to train and equip Christians to live in this world, to maybe even be able to afford to bring people like Dr. Simpson and a team out here and have training events to train Christian economics students to think carefully over economics and how to engage, to train law students and so forth and so on. And if we can generate income, we can increase Rasha Christie's impact here in South Africa, but also see RC expand into other countries in Africa, like Lesotho and Zimbabwe and other countries to the north of the Limpopo. But thank you very much, folks, for everything, and God bless all of you. And we look forward to seeing you and hearing from you next week. Thank you, Dr. Simpson. Thank you, John. And thank you, Andre, our tech guy, for